Okay, so I'm going to get us started this morning. You are at the Faith at Work session, and so I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what we're going to do this morning, and then just talk a little bit myself about one of the topics, which is the disconnect and the difficulty of work. And then Trey is going to come up, and he is going to share about the design and the dignity and the definition of work, the biblical theology of work, which is going to be awesome. And of course, Trey will have a lot of fun videos and things like that. And then Traci is going to come up. Sorry, my ear thing's not working. There we go. Traci's going to come up and invite 4 professionals, adults that live in our community and serve and work every day, and they are going to put some skin on the topics that we're going to be covering through a panel discussion. So that's what the morning is going to look like. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to help you think this through a little bit by asking you a couple of questions. Do you think that most people view their work as drudgery, as a necessary evil, as just working for the money because that's what they have to do? Do you think most people think that? Or do you feel like most people view work as this awesome, great fulfillment of their personal passion, that they're able to really participate in something bigger than themselves? Which do you think it is? We all know that we kind of come to the topic of work from many messages that we've received throughout our life. It depends how you feel about work, how you were raised. You know, did your family of origin teach you about work? The media, messages in your schooling. All these things teach us about work and form our view and opinion of work. So I happened to grow up in a home that valued work. My dad is an industrial engineer, and he taught us at an early age that work was good. And in his job, he actually worked on systems for efficiency and best practices in the work environment. And sort of those things spilled over into our home life. So I remember as a young child, my dad would teach us how to do chores, and he would give us incentives and salaries and bonus systems. So I kind of grew up thinking work was awesome, actually. My dad also had a family motto, and that he drilled sort of into our heads all the time: plan your work and work your plan. So, that's a pretty good motto, right? Plan your work and work your plan. Feel free to use that in your families as you grow up. I'm not sure I'm getting this clicker going here. Sorry. Get my slides going here. Trey, oh, there we go. Where am I supposed to point it up a little bit? No. Sorry about that, y'all. Oh. Okay, that stole my thunder. So, darn. Okay, so anyway, I was just about to say that, so my dad also encouraged us as soon as we can to go out and get a real job, okay? So in the glorious year of 1978, I did get a job at, Carl's Jr. Okay, who knows about Carl's Jr., right? Oh, you all do. Okay, I grew up in California, so I wasn't sure Carl's Jr. was here in Texas, but anyway, okay, so I worked at Carl's Jr. in the glorious year of 1978, and I worked there for about a year, and basically I smelled like a French fry for the entire year. It was an awesome motivator to go to college and try to get into college, but it was actually my first time where I felt like, yikes, work is hard. Work is menial. Work is boring. Work is distasteful. I began to see that this maybe isn't as fun as my dad said it was. So it turns out that this is a very common experience for most people in America. In 2013, the Gallup organization did a poll, and they found, they identified 3 types of employees. Okay, I'm seriously having trouble with this. Sorry. Okay, advance it for me. Awesome. 3 types of employees. Let's see if we can get that slide up. Okay, the first type is called engaged, and this is what we all want to be. Employees that work with passion feel a profound connection to their work. The second group was called not engaged. These are the employees that are sort of checked out and they're just sort of sleepwalking through their day. They're putting in their time, they're going to work, but it's not really where their energy is. And then finally, the third group, the scariest group, is called actively disengaged. And these employees aren't just unhappy, but they are busy acting out their unhappiness and really undermining their workplace. Next slide. So here shows you, this poll was a 12-year study. So if you can see, the very top shows the engaged, the people that are really tracking with their job, is 30%. And this wasn't just an aberration like for 1 year. This is a decades-long study. The biggest group is the non-engaged, and then the third group is the actively disengaged. So when you add together the not engaged and the actively disengaged, that's 70%. 70% of the American workforce isn't tracking with their job. Only 30% of the people are. This has serious implications for individuals, for businesses, and for the state of the economy in general. And we as believers can speak into that. The oral historian Studs Terkel, in his book, next slide please, wrote this, his book called Working. Most people live somewhere between a grudging acceptance of their job and an active dislike of it. And we know this is not new to the 21st century. We're going to be studying the book of Ecclesiastes on Sunday mornings, and the ancient wise man Solomon had a lot to say about work, and this is what he had to say. Next slide, please. Here's Solomon's view of work. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair about all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill and must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This is also vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils under the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. So that's kind of a gloomy outlook, right? If 70% of the people are disconnected from their work, what can we do as believers to avoid falling into that same category ourselves? How can we stay engaged and active and passionate about our jobs? And then how can we encourage those around us, those 70% of the people in our world, to actively engage in their job? So that's my brief introduction to the problem, and then Trey is going to come up and talk about the solution. So before he does, we don't want this to just be us talking to you. We want you to talk to each other. So as he's coming up, I've got 2 questions that I want you to answer. Huddle up in like groups of 2 or 3, and here's the 2 questions I want you to talk about. If they're sort of like true confessions. So number 1 is tell each other your first job, okay? What was your very first paid job? Maybe it was a fast food job like me, I don't know. And then second, think about which category you might be in right now. This is like, get real with each other, okay? Are you engaged? Are you disengaged? Or are you actively disengaged? Okay, quickly talk to each other about that. Okay, thanks.
I know you guys are still probably talking a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and bring it in and kind of unpack where we're going to go. As Carolyn said, kind of looked a little bit of this idea that there's a disconnect between our faith and our work. It has a whole host of reasons why I think sometimes even the church has been silent on the topic that's kind of at times exasperated that disconnect. And so what I want to do for the next 30 or 35 minutes is try to help reconnect these two big ideas. How does our faith connect with our work? Exactly how do these two guys fit together? We're going to kind of do that through a few different ideas. One is that God has a design for our work. Also, that there's great dignity to work. And then lastly, if we have time, we'll get to this idea of a new definition for work. That God has designed work, that there's a dignity to it. And then lastly, that there's a definition that we can kind of begin to reimagine work is what I want to do with us this morning. As we do that, there's a couple of resources, a couple sources that we're going to pull a lot from. First is Timothy Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor. There's probably not a more foundational or more seminal book on the topic that we're going to unpack than that one. In fact, a lot of what we're going to talk through this morning is going to come from Keller's book. And so even as you guys exit this morning, I highly encourage you guys to hit the resource table, purchase that book, grab it, work through it this spring. Fantastic resource on this topic. Also, Timothy Keller's church, Redeemer Presbyterian in New York, has their own Center for Faith and Work. You can follow them on Twitter. You can go to their website. Tons of resources, videos, publications. They're done more on this topic than probably any church in the United States. Fantastic resources if you want to go a little bit further. But those are going to be two sources that we pull from a lot this morning as I quote and as I kind of walk through kind of where we're going to go. We're going to kind of launch off first on this idea of God's design for work. And really as we begin to unpack that, one of the first things we're going to see as we look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is that God was the first to work. That really our scriptures open up with a story of the first work week, if you will. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 3, we find a summary of all that God did in Genesis 1. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and by the seventh day God completed his work. And he rested on the seventh day from all of his work, which he had done. And then God rested from all of his work, which he had created and he had made. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3, you get a great summary of what God did in Genesis 1, which was work. It couldn't be more clear as to what Genesis 1 was about, but it was about the work of God. In fact, if you were to peruse back through Genesis 1, some of the verbs in Genesis 1 that highlight the work of God are these. God created, God separated, God made, God gathered, God placed, and God blessed. That really a lot of the activity of Genesis 1 are very normal verbs that highlight really much of what you do 8 to 5 in whatever workplace that you're in. It's no different than what God did in Genesis 1, other than creating out of nothing, right? That he creates out of nothing, and then he cultivates that, he shapes that, he separates that, he forms it, and he keeps it. In Genesis 1, we get an incredible picture of the first work week. And really even more of that, you get an incredible picture of what is the meaning and the significance of work. I love this quote from Keller when he says this, coming up on the next slide. He says, speaking of Genesis 1, he says, in the beginning, God worked. Work was not a necessary evil that came into the picture later or something human beings were created to do, but it was beneath the great God himself. No, God worked for the sheer joy of it. Work could not have had a more exalted inauguration. For a lot of us, as we think about work, sometimes we recognize the great difficulty and sometimes the disconnect we feel between our faith and our work. And there's almost this ingrained idea that maybe work is a product of the fall. That maybe work is the curse that God handed to humanity. But what we see from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is that no. Work was present way before the fall. In fact, God was the first to work, and it could not have had a more exalted inauguration. So good was work that God not only worked himself, but then he hands and he commissions this great task off to humanity themselves and to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. We're going to see not just the work of God, but we're going to see the work of man as well. That it's not just that God was the first to work, but he commissions humanity themselves to work as well. And as you jump into Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and you look at the work of man, I want to give you guys a few of the verbs that you see from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. We find that Adam and Eve were told to rule, to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue the earth, to cultivate it, and to keep it. That Adam and Eve were to rule, that they were to be fruitful, they were to multiply, they were to fill the earth, they were to subdue it, cultivate it, and keep it. Really, their task of work as they stepped into the garden was that of a gardener. And really, I'm going to argue to you guys as we walk through the rest of the scriptures that really gardening becomes the analogy for most of all work. That in some sense it can be seen as a gardener who steps into the natural created order manages and develops that which God has entrusted to humanity. That's what work is. It's the task of managing and handling that which God has entrusted in the natural order to you and I so that we develop it, we form it, we create, and we cultivate, just as we saw God do. God works, he hands off work to humanity. It has an incredible inauguration. It was a good thing. God looked at his work, he declared that it was good, and as he looked at his creation, he looked at Adam and he said it was not good that Adam was alone. And so he creates Eve. Why does he create Eve? Is it primarily to fix Adam's broken heart and loneliness? No. Eve is a creation alongside of Adam to be a helpmate, to be a partner, to fulfill the great task of work that God commissioned Adam to. And so Eve comes alongside of Adam so that they together as a partnership can fulfill the task of work that they were commissioned to by God himself. Work is not a product of the curse. It was there before the curse. The curse is going to make work hard, which is why we feel difficulty at times in it. But as we look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we look at the work of God, the work of man, it has an incredible, incredible beginning. Incredible beginning. In fact, as we think about work, really it becomes the framing point of much of the purpose for humanity and much of the role and the purpose that he has in life. So much so that Keller will say this about the significance of work. Without meaningful work, we sense significant inner loss and emptiness. We don't merely need the money from work to survive. We need the work itself to survive and to live fully human lives. If you've ever been through a period of unemployment, or even an extended vacation at times, and you're disengaged from contributing or doing something with your life, it gets incredibly difficult. Unemployment can be one of the hardest struggles to work yourself through. I'll tell you guys, even on a very superficial level, a few years ago, Marcy and I were in Thailand on a vacation and at a conference for literally about 3 weeks. The first week was a conference, the next 2 weeks were a vacation, and I will forever remember about 10 days into that trip, a conference that I didn't feel super engaged with, and then a vacation that was great. But about 10, 12 days into this, I remember at one point walking the beach with my wife and saying this, "Honey, I feel adrift, I feel depressed, I feel directionless with my life. I don't know what I'm doing," right? I'm in the most beautiful place in the world, and she's trying to find me a counselor. Like, it happened that fast, okay? And if that's kind of a little preview, even more so, I love the movie WALL-E, all right? Some of you guys might have seen it, because the movie WALL-E will provide you and I a picture of what work would be like, or a future would be like if we had no work whatsoever. As much as we look forward to retirement, as much as we look forward to a vacation, that really if human life was devoid of work or production, here's a little bit of what it would look like. All right, a picture of the future that's devoid of work, and the picture does not look so attractive, does it? Because there is something ingrained in us that we are designed to work. Tom Nelson, another great resource on this topic of faith and work in the book Work Matters, says this. Wally reminds us that a do-nothing couch potato existence is actually repulsive and dehumanizing. Well, why is this? As human beings, we were not created to be do-nothings. We were created with work in mind. That God's design for human purpose, that God's design from the very beginning of the scriptural narrative included work. That was absolutely tied into why we exist and the purpose for our lives, and it's good. Work is good. We're designed to work, and without it, we struggle at an inner level that really there is no way we can grasp that or even at times recover from that, that work is vital to who we are. And because we've been designed to work, it's no surprise that it has incredible dignity as well. Because we've been designed to work, it has incredible dignity. And what I want to highlight for you, though, and what I want to expand for you this morning is what kind of work demonstrates the dignity that God intended for work. That it's not just that we've been designed for work, but that it has dignity. And the question is, what kind of work demonstrates that dignity? Really, as we kind of unpack the Genesis narrative and as it continues, what we're going to see this morning is that really it's the kind of work that creates and cultivates, that demonstrates the dignity that God intended for work all the way back to Genesis. Work that creates and cultivates demonstrates the dignity that God intended for work all the way going back to Genesis. In fact, it's interesting, Keller will say this about work. He says that God made the world to need work. If you think back to the Genesis narrative, initially the earth was formless and void, and then God came and he made and he separated and he structured and he cultivated. That the earth was initially formless and void. It needed development, and so he began to develop it and structured it in its creation. And then he hands that over to Adam and Eve, and it's not a finished product. That what God wants for the world, what God wants for the earth is not a finished product. And so part of what Adam and Eve's job is to step into the creation and to continue to create and cultivate within it as God had entrusted it to them. Philosopher Al Walters will say it this way and expand on this idea when he says, the earth had been completely unformed and empty. And in the 6-day process of development, God had formed it and filled it, but not completely. People must now carry on the work of development by being fruitful. They fill it even more. By subduing it, they must form it even more. As God's representatives, we carry on where God left off. But this is now to be a human development of the earth. The human race will fill the earth with its own kind, and it will form the earth for its own kind. And from now on, the development of the created earth will be societal and cultural in nature. There's something in us that God, I think, placed, that there's a delight that we have to create. There's something in us inherently that gives us a passion and a delight to create, which is why that kind of work has dignity. I don't know what your favorite board game is, but I'll tell you one of the first games I remember as a child was the game SimCity. You can pull out the next slide. And there's a whole lot of games like this. Risk is, one of my favorites, the game of international conquest. Civilization, or some of you guys, there's a certain culture around it, but Settlers of Catan, all right? That might be you. But all of these games, I think, appeal to this thing in us that loves to build, that loves to create, that loves to develop, and loves to form. It's a Genesis narrative unpacked in a game for us, taking that which was natural from the beginning and expanding it and creating it further. There's something in us that has a delight to create. Game makers know this and they appeal to it, and so does the tool company Craftsman. And here's a video of one of their commercials that I think highlights this delight that we have to create. I love how Craftsman puts it, we were born made to make. We were made to make, we were made to create. That was part of the design God had from us for the very beginning. I think game makers and tool makers realize something that we've often missed, and that was there's something in us as God designed us, not just for work, but a work that calls us to create and cultivate the natural order. Keller will develop us further on these ideas, and he'll say this in this next quote. He says, filling the earth means civilization, not just procreation. We get the sense that God does not want merely more individuals of the human species. He also wants the world to be filled with a human society. He could have just spoken the word and created millions of people and thousands of human settlements, but he didn't. He made it our job to develop and to build this society. It's interesting to me as you look at our scriptures. In Genesis, we have a garden that shows up. And then in Revelation, when we have a new heavens and a new earth, we don't get a garden that shows up, but we get a city. We get the development of what God intended as we're going to look at the future. And so it's really interesting as we look at the Genesis narrative. I think what God is calling Adam and Eve to there in Genesis is not just the procreation and the biological filling of the earth, but it's the development of the established and natural order to become something new. It's really interesting as we pack this idea out. Another word for civilization or society would be the word we often use as culture. That what we're seeing in Genesis 1 and 2 that's going to continue is not just development, but it's a cultural development. But even as you think about culture, I'll tell you, I think that word in a church context has a lot of baggage to it. In fact, there's a lot of senses of what we think culture is that I think we need to redefine it for ourselves, because I think what Keller's appealing to here and what he's seeing as a part of our work, the development of the created order, the establishment and advancement of a kingdom and a society and a civilization is really tied into what is all about culture. It's interesting as we think about culture, well, what is culture not? Sometimes whenever I think of culture, I think of some snooty, yuppie couple in a metropolitan art museum looking at modern art with kind of a glass of champagne and their pinky finger out, right? That's kind of my view of culture sometimes. Or if it's not that, sometimes as we think of culture, we think of some really abstract, big concept of a world out there that in our church world we always see as the culture is evil, all right? Andy Crouch, in his book called Culture Making, which is another great resource on this whole topic of faith at work, he says this about our way of speaking about culture. He says, there's no such thing as the culture. And any attempt to talk about the culture is misled and misleading. And what he's trying to appeal to here is that culture is actually way more of a tangible, concrete thing than when we talk about the culture as an abstract reality. It's also not inherently evil. Often when we think of the culture, that which is always out there, we almost equate it to the world or some order that is contrary to God intuitively. And I don't think that's what culture is. In fact, Crouch will appeal to a definition by a guy named Ken Myers of what culture is when he says this, that culture is what human beings make of the world. Again, this is appealing to this idea that work that has dignity is a work that creates and cultivates. This gets tied into what culture is all about. And that culture is what human beings make of the world. Specifically, it kind of has a double meaning there that is what we literally and physically make, but it's also that which it has in terms of what we make in terms of meaning. And so in terms of what we make, literally, even in Genesis, we see a series of cultural concrete goods that are created. If you want to pull this slide up, even in Genesis, one of the first cultural goods that we see that is made are clothes. When Adam and Eve fall into sin, the first cultural good we see that comes out of the natural order are clothes. That God takes the natural order and he develops it in such a way that he hands clothes off to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve in Genesis 4 will make tools, verse 2 and verse 22. In 21 of chapter 4, they will make music. And in chapter 9, verse 21, they will make wine, which you can take that however you want, all right? But these are all manufactured or developed physical goods. This is what culture does. Culture makes things out of the world. So what Craftsman is appealing to, what do you want to make? You were made to make. We see it all the way beginning in Genesis in the narrative as it unfolds. That part of what culture is that it is a physical production of the created order into a new kind of way. It is making the unseen now seen. It's a development of something that wasn't there prior from the resources that were there. But it's also a making of meaning. And so culture helps derive meaning out of our world. Why are we here? Why do we exist? Who am I? Is there a God? What does God want from my life? Culture doesn't just appeal to physical things that we make, but it also appeals to an abstract sense of meaning and definition of our existence. And in either way, culture can move us in a positive way or it can move us in a negative way, but culture in and of itself is not bad. Culture can make bad things that are evil and sinful, but it can also make great things. Crouch will say, and I think a very interesting thing as we begin to think about how do we engage culture, especially with the view of the workplace. This is what he says about culture, and I think he's going to really, in a sense, push us in a new direction. In this quote, when he talks about, he says, cultural change will only happen when something new displaces, to some extent, existing culture in a very tangible way. That often as we think of the culture as a world order that's out there, that's negative or hostile to God, often our responses as the church is to criticize culture, to condemn culture, to consume culture, or to boycott culture. But really what Crouch is saying is that if we really want to change culture, you don't just copy it, you don't just consume it, you don't just criticize it. That doesn't really do much to culture. What you do is you engage culture and you create something new and it displaces the old order of culture. That even as we think about our vocations, that's what culture does. I'm going to go back to a few of these pictures that we just ran through, but what nature creates is the fire. What culture creates is the fireplace, okay? The natural order that we house, that we control, we create the fireplace. Nature creates a wild garden or a wild set of flowers, and culture creates a garden that has order, that has structure, that has control. It's developed into something new. My favorite, nature creates bushes, and culture creates bushes that are shaped like Mickey and Minnie, okay? This is Disney, okay? That's the embodiment of what culture creates. It's a manufactured, concrete reality that also has some sense of meaning. It's the happiest place on earth, right? Okay, that's what culture does, and it calls us, as we think about the church, not to retreat from culture, but to engage and to enter into culture, and our vocations become one of the greatest ways that we can engage our culture. Robert Bella, in a book called Habits of the Heart, says this, as you think about vocation impacting culture, he says this. I'm going to pull that quote up. To make a real difference in our world, there would have to be a reappropriation of the idea of vocation, a reimagining of vocation and work, or a return in a new way to the idea of work as a contribution to the good of all and not merely as a means to one's own advancement. As we think about our world, as we think about our culture, really your vocations become one of the greatest ways for you to impact the world at large. But in order for your vocation to have that kind of impact, it's going to cause and it's going to require us to begin to reimagine the purpose of vocation. And as Bella says, in a way that it's not just about one's own advancement, but for the good of all. Which is why the second kind of work that really shows dignity to work is not just work that creates and cultivates, as we see God do and hand off to Adam and Eve, but a work that is about the benefit of others. Keller has a seminal definition early on in his book, and it's this, as he talks about vocation and how we're to reimagine it. He says, a job is a vocation only if someone else calls you to do it and you do it for them rather than for yourself. Think about to the Renaissance period where you'd have artists that were commissioned for the city or for the church to produce art. It's that same kind of idea. That work is a commission, work is a vocation in which someone has called you into it, not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And so our work can only be reimagined as a mission or a service to something beyond merely our own interest. And as we shall see, thinking of work mainly as a means of self-advancement and self-realization slowly crushes a person and undermines society itself. You don't have to look very far in news headlines to see when people have taken their careers merely as their own self-advancement, how it undermines not just their company, but the social fabric of our country and even the world at large now with a global economy. That the kind of work that has dignity is work that leads to a creation and a cultivation modeled after Genesis 1 and 2, as the world is developed into a more and more civilized order, and a kind of production in which it's all about love of neighbor. Some of you guys have iPhones. You may love Apple. You may feel that all that Apple does is a loving contribution to your life, right? That's what economy, that's what vocation can be. I laugh even at their advertisements as they talk about the iPhone. It's like it's a work of art to them, all right? There's a sensualness with which they talk about it, right? In their minds, it's as if they are artists and as if they've been commissioned in a loving way to society to bless it and to nourish it, all right? That's how Apple sees their calling, if you will. And really, as we begin to unpack this idea, one of my favorite verses comes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, speaking about vocation and love. And this is what Paul says to the church of Thessalonica. He says, we urge you to excel still more in love. Command that he gave them a few verses earlier, but notice how they're going to excel in love specifically. And to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and to attend to your own business and to work with your hands, just as we commanded you so that you will behave properly toward outsiders. The way that the Thessalonica church was to excel in love in their city and in their community was through their vocations, was through their work, as a contribution to the city and as a contribution to those around them, so that they could behave properly in love toward those that were around them. They would see something different in the way that they handled their vocations. That work is a loving contribution, which is why I love this next quote from Thomas Merton. And he says this about all vocations. He says, all vocations are intended by God to manifest his love in the world. Do you see your degree and do you see your vocation with that kind of commissioning charge? That it's a loving mission to the world. It's interesting, I think for some of us, we really struggle with that because we have a wrong definition of work. And what I want to do to wrap up here quickly is to give you guys a new definition of work. How much time do we got, Carolyn? Okay, I want to wrap up and give you guys kind of a new paradigm or a new definition of work, and I want to blow away a few dichotomies. And the first is this. As we think about work, we're not necessarily I want to blow away the dichotomy of paid versus unpaid work. That when I'm speaking about work and we look at the Genesis narrative and we think about work, work is not just for pay. It's not just to a company. That work is included in what you do in your home life. Work is included in your civic life. If you're a student right now, you are working even though you aren't getting paid. In fact, you are paying to work your tail off, right? One day, Lord willing, you will graduate and you will get some money from work, all right? Right now, you're paying to work, but it's work and it's really hard work. Civics, school life, academic life, family life, or employment life, all of it is work, whether you're getting paid or not. Second of all, I think in our contemporary society, we have an incredible dichotomy that's created between secular and sacred. Between, in a sense, the workplace and the church, if you will. And I want to blow that dichotomy away as well. And that what work is, what God's called us to as we look at the Genesis narrative, is not this kind of church work versus non-church work. Or if you are an engineer or an accountant, then you're not necessarily in ministry. In fact, as you look at that word ministry, it's always just denoted as work in the Greek. There's no designation between the kind of office or the kind of work that we have. It's interesting. Honestly, I'll say this, even kind of going to this idea more, that often I think the rhetoric I've heard over the years is this, that if you are a Christian in the workplace, typically this is what the church has said. The connection of your faith with your work, if you are in a secular workplace, I'm doing this secular, okay? Because I want to blow away that dichotomy, is twofold typically. One, they'll say that you're going to make money in a workplace that you can give to the church, or you're going to be around coworkers that you can share the gospel with and you can bring them to the church. But beyond those two benefits, typically the church has not said much. And here's what I want to say about those two benefits. A, those two benefits in terms of the money you make that you can give to the church or the coworkers that you could share the gospel with that you can invite to the church are both indirect to the job itself. They're both indirect to the job itself. If you're an engineer or accountant 8 hours a day, it's not about the money that you're going to give to the church, and it's not about necessarily the coworkers that you could invite to the church. Second of all, both of those benefits are highly church-centric. Why is the benefit of the workplace only going to be recognized if it feeds back into the walls of the church? I think our definitions are way too narrow. Because what is the direct benefit of a vocation if it doesn't necessarily have to feed into the walls of the church? Surely there's something to be said for what one would do 8 hours a day, whether that's in a classroom, whether that's in an engineering firm, accounting, medicine, whatever your vocation may be. There's this definition dichotomy issue that we've got to blow away. In fact, the quote that I love here comes from Martin Luther, the great reformer, and he says this about this dichotomy between sacred and secular. He says this, that it is pure invention that pope, bishops, priests, and monks are called the spiritual estate, while princes, lords, artisans, and farmers are called the temporal estate. This is indeed a piece of deceit and hypocrisy, and yet no one need be intimidated by it, and that for this reason. All Christians are truly of the spiritual estate. And there is no difference among them except that of office. We are all consecrated priests. What the great reformer is doing here is not just highlighting the priesthood of all believers. What he's doing is he's highlighting that there is a distinction of office at times or vocation, but that distinction is not one that is sacred and one that is secular. That all are in ministry, all are in the commission that God has invited us in partnership into in terms of the created order. That for whatever reason, we can think about the connection of faith and work for the pastor or the missionary who the church brings up on stage and we celebrate. But have we not commissioned the engineer and the teacher and the stay-at-home mom as well? We've really missed this, I think. Because the church has only exacerbated, I think, this dichotomy of sacred and secular. And so if you're not in a church-based role, if you're not in a vocational ministry role, you still are in ministry. Your office, your ministry looks different. And it's not that your workplace is just a mission field as if it's just that place where you can invite people to church. No. The task that you have in whatever vocation that you're in is eternally meaningful and significant. One of my favorite lines from Mike Schaub, he'll say here probably a little bit later too, is your vocation, your workplace is not a distraction to the kingdom, it is the kingdom. Your workplace is also not a distraction to your sanctification. It is the greatest place probably for your sanctification because you're going to be there way more than you may even be at home or even in the church. The place, the sphere that you live your life in the most, where your greatest contribution to the world at large will be through your vocation. We need some new definitions because it's a definitional problem that in many ways has caused this great disconnect between faith and work. Because we can only see certain kinds of work that have a connection to faith, and we've really missed the boat as to what vocation is all about and a definition for faith and work. Last quote I want to give you guys is one of my favorite. It comes here, a character in a play called Atlas Shrugged, and the character says this: whether it's a symphony or a coal mine, all work is an act of creating and comes from the same source. The capacity to see, to connect, and to make what had not been seen, connected, and made before. All work, all vocation is that venue and that opportunity to take what had not been seen before and to make it seen as we create and as we cultivate for the benefit of our cities and our communities and our world. And as we do that, all of a sudden our work ends up having a great similarity to the thread of faith. Faith, which is trust in the unseen, belief in the unseen. What work does is it makes the unseen now seen in the present world order. And all of a sudden, faith and work are not so diametrically opposed at all, but they're partners and they go hand in hand. I'm going to end here with a video from the Center of Faith and Work coming out of Keller's Church, and it really highlights this idea that faith and work are not so contrasting, but they actually go hand in hand, helping the unseen become seen.
Fantastic video. Thank you very much. My name is Traci Toone, and I am, hi, welcome. You want to go ahead and grab that? I'm here on staff at Grace Bible, working in the college ministry as a college coordinator and also over our Grace Alumni Network, our new initiative that we would love to talk more about later on. But my main role up here today is to MC this wonderful panel that we've got up here of 4 loving, courageous professionals that have come to talk and to inspire us about how they have been able to mix, or their experience with mixing their faith and their work, integrating those two, talking about the blessings and the challenges that that has led to. So while I do work on staff here at the church. This is actually my 3rd profession. I'm kind of like Jonah. Every time I leave College Station, God calls me back here, and I come back kicking and screaming, but it's been great. And so that kind of path that he's led me on to bring me up here to this stage today, I have a background in health education. Both of my degrees are from Texas A&M, and through that, he's led me on quite a wild ride. That led me overseas to Australia to go do an internship. That led me to San Francisco to be in healthcare consulting, to where I quickly realized that that was not the role for me that he wanted for me. And so then that brought me to the higher education world, where I worked for 5 years, implementing various health initiatives on college campuses to make them a healthier place. And through that time, he led me to volunteer for various parachurch ministries, to where that planted a seed that 5 years later, when God called me with this opportunity to come here to Grace Bible, I was ready to accept it. And so that's kind of the path that he's led me on here. And so I worked so much in students' physical health and making the environment a healthier place. So now I get to really pour into people's spiritual health and develop them in that way. And so it's an honor and a joy to have that background and that unique path. And so I want to invite our panelists here to just kind of introduce themselves and the unique path that the Lord has brought them on to be where they're at today. They all should be on and ready to go.
Am I on?
I think you may have turned it off. Do you want to?
I do.
Would you like to start? It's on.
Sure. Is mine on? Mm-hmm. My name's Davis Watson. I grew up here in Bryan and went to Baylor undergrad and then ultimately law school at Baylor as well. My wife Molly's here to my left. We met there in school and got married in law school. I went to Austin after graduating from law school and worked for a firm that was based out of Austin, had been there for a long time. And then I guess 1 or 2 years into that, I got recruited from a firm that was based out of San Francisco that came to Austin in the mid to late 90s. And so worked for that firm, and it was a global firm. We had about 1,000 attorneys, and so it was a unique experience for me to kind of be in that corporate world. And then in 2002, we decided to move back here to Bryan. Molly was pregnant with our first child, and I really wanted a change in my career path. I do trial work, and we weren't trying as many cases in the big firms as that I thought I'd have an opportunity to do here. So we've been back here since 2002 and have a law firm, and we've got 3 boys, and that's kind of my background in schooling.
Great.
I'm Molly Watson, Davis's wife, and primarily we raised these three crazy boys now that are 9, 11, and 13. I went to Baylor, and I have a degree in communications and a master's in organizational communication. But for the past 20 years, I've been in the nonprofit world for the most part, sometimes being paid to raise money and sometimes volunteering. And right now I work for Baylor. They took me away from the Bush School here, and I live here and get to work for my alma mater, which is nice, and I raise money for them. So I've been pretty much in that nonprofit world for the past 20 years, and I also raise money, and I'm on a couple of nonprofit boards here in town. And that's my heart, is philanthropy, and so I'll have a little bit more to share about that as we move forward.
Great.
think this works. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
My name is Stephen Wright. I have lived here in College Station since 2003. I grew up in the Valley in Harlingen, the son of an orthopedic surgeon, and it was under him that I got my desire to be in healthcare. Went to Furman University in South Carolina for my undergraduate work. I have a master's in chemistry. Through that whole time, my goal, my desire was to be in medicine. For whatever reason, if you could fail at getting into medical school, I did it. But through it, though, and through my experiences of then becoming a high school science teacher, and my time there, that led me into becoming a dentist. I went to school in San Antonio, became a dentist, and moved back here in 2003. Was an associate and worked under a couple dentists here in town. And a couple years ago, purchased the practice from a dentist that's now retired. I have 3 kids, 14, 12, and 10. So, my work is begins a new job after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So, anyway, that's how I got here.
Hello, master's in chemistry, Stephen. Wow, okay. Pretty sure I made a D in chemistry, high school. And I'm a teacher, so there you go. I'm Andrea Pale, and by my profession, I'm a teacher. I graduated from Texas A&M, class of 2000, did a victory lap. But I was a teacher for 10 years just down the road at College Station ISD. And then I moved into an administrative role at central office with the early childhood program for the district, Head Start and pre-K for 5 years. And then I was approached by a consulting firm fairly recently, about 2 years ago, to begin doing some consulting for them nationally for Head Start. And so I resigned from my position within the school district last May. So I'm currently navigating a very new role, really working closely with Head Start agencies throughout the country. So in addition, I am Ryan's wife, and we have 2 8-year-old twins. And so, as you know, that's its own full-time job. So glad to be here.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here and just for sharing a little bit about yourself. So we heard in the video that when what we do hits why we do, we either wither or flourish. And so we all want to flourish in what we're doing and in our everyday lives, whether that's at home or out in the workplace. And so sometimes, though, that can be a little bit hard to glean what that actually looks like. So we've invited you here to kind of talk about what that's looked like in your lives. And so first question I want to ask you guys is, how do you see God's purposes for his kingdom fulfilled in your workplace? And specifically, what does it look like for you to live out your faith in the workplace?
I'll start on that one, I guess. I think that the thing that I've learned from just being in dentistry and why I got into dentistry and into medicine was to find significance. To find significance in what I was doing and growing up, being the son of a physician. I grew up seeing my father go and help people. He would go and help people at all hours. Some weekends we wouldn't see him because he was doing, surgery or whatnot, and that always impressed me, and I wanted to be a part of that. And out of that, I did get into dentistry. I think that it's a good, it fits my personality. I wanted to be part of a family. I wanted to be in the healthcare, and I wanted to be a doctor. So I think it fit all of those. I think that how does it look like to live out my faith in the workplace? I think that I have seen that more and more over the years, that I have the opportunity to show love to people. And showing love to people can be as simple as smiling at them. It can be as simple as just showing that you care for someone. It can be something as simple as giving a hug. It can also be, kind of stepping out and being willing to pray for someone. And I've seen that and seen the importance of that in people's lives. I've had a few opportunities to, kind of be able to share my faith. I'm not probably the most bold person in terms of sharing the gospel in the workplace per se. But two, as far as employees, I'm now a business owner, and even as an associate, I would interact with the employees in the office. And everything I just said just a few seconds ago pertains to them as well. And probably the biggest example has been in the last couple of years. I've had some things happen in our office that, kind of forced me to step forward and to kind of share some things to my employees about, being a Christian and also sin, and what that means to me, and then also to show love out of that. So I think that, I'm finding that, what Trey was saying about work and Christianity and my walk with the Lord, it definitely is all blended together.
I guess faith in the workplace for my job, it's kind of unique because I'm constantly in conflict. I'm opposite somebody every day, whether it's in the courtroom or just on the phone. And that sounds probably pretty odd if you feel like you live in conflict, but I don't view it that way because essentially I'm advocating my client's position in the best light that I can. I don't create facts. I discover them and then present them. And the unique thing about being in litigation is you're constantly maybe opposite another attorney or another party, and I always try my best never to belittle anyone else. I believe if you treat your opposing counsel or party with respect, even though you're against them, that essentially that's the best approach. I firmly believe that in jury trials, juries are sympathetic to witnesses. They don't want to see someone attacked for no reason. And so I try to do it in a dignified way to get the facts out, to advocate my client's position, but do it respectfully. And so if I can do that on a day-to-day basis, then I feel like that's one way that I can live out my faith, because I know that even though I may be opposite against them, that they certainly have the same worth in God's eyes as I do. So that's kind of a day-to-day application on what I see, even though I'm always kind of entrenched in a battle.
You have time? Go ahead. Well, I work for a Christian organization, so having faith is kind of expected, and we pray there. And it's a little bit like working for a church. I haven't ever worked for a church. I do think there's, it's interesting. Sometimes when you work for a nonprofit that has a slim, workforce, you've got to do a little bit more always. And then you take that Christian perspective. I do think I have a unique opportunity a lot of times to do a lot more than you feel like you have time for, or that's healthy for you. So it's interesting, in all my nonprofit positions, you feel a little stretched. And at times, it's all under the call and the mission and the service that Keller talked about that the Lord's calling you to, right? But sometimes you got to say no. And so I think that's an interesting thing about the nonprofit world, especially when you take that Christian perspective in an organization. You're called to do this. You don't step up, you're not really fulfilling the mission that the Lord's called you to. Well, there is a little bit of prayer that needs to go into that before you get overcommitted and overstretched for your family. But as far as showing my faith at Baylor, it's expected, and primarily our organization in development that has 67 employees are believers, and that's a nice thing.
Can I go to the next? Are we good? You can go. Okay, great. I think in terms of the question also, how do we see God's purposes, his kingdom purposes in our work? I appreciate that Trey mentioned Genesis 1 and 2, because one of God's purposes ultimately is cultivating and creating. And so I think while I don't necessarily have the opportunity every day to overtly share my faith, I do have the opportunity always to participate with God in his creative and redemptive work. And so because we are a redeemed people, our work therefore is a redemptive task. And so what that looks like for me is that I often have the opportunity to, as I'm coaching teachers, to help them connect their own work to really the flourishing of human, of just really in the world. And so what is their work? How are they attached to the garden? How does their work relate to the garden, as Trey mentioned? And so specifically what that looks like for me is we work in Head Start. If you don't know about Head Start, they qualify by either being low income or having disabilities. And so what that means is that by coaching teachers in my role and connecting them to their work, what happens is they ultimately, in their work, through the use of their gifts, the application of their knowledge and their skills, them understanding and being proficient in their knowledge and skills, they even have the opportunity to change or shape brain architecture for early childhood, for young children. And so the implications of that are endless as it relates to God's redemptive work in the world, the way that he's actively restoring in the world. So.
Great, thank you. Those are all great perspectives, and I loved hearing how each of you, whether it's how you conduct yourselves in your business or in your tasks throughout the day, or even how you run your business and how and those maybe under you, those are all great ways in which you can participate in God's purpose for your profession. But I want to talk about the flip side of that too. Like, what are areas of your work that are challenging or potentially compromise your faith, and how do you deal with that?
You want to take that? I was thinking about that question this morning, talking with Molly, and there's always a possibility, and to give you kind of a little background in a lawsuit, if someone files a lawsuit and they have an attorney and then they're making a claim against another person and so they have an attorney, you go through a period that's called discovery before you go to trial, and discovery means that you get to discover the other party's claims or defenses, and then you trade documents, and so they can ask for your documents and vice versa. There's certainly a possibility, and it happens, that there may be a bad document that someone has asked for, and it's not good for your client. Well, abuse is a possibility, and where someone, if they've properly asked for it, you have an obligation and a duty to turn that over, even though it's a bad document. And so it happens that there's sometimes people abuse a system and do not turn over the bad documents. I believe that the truth is going to come out. Every side always has bad facts. You've got to address them up front, deal with them, but you can't hide it. And so there's always a possibility of abuse in litigation, just like there is probably in any other type of business if someone doesn't tell the truth or is not forthright when asked a question. But so that's always a possibility, and I always try to make sure that even when my client brings me the documents, I see it and it may sting, it's like but there's never a hint of I'm not going to turn that over. So.
This is a tough question, I think, for me. I think that three things kind of come to mind. I think during my day, I think time is one challenge that can challenge my faith, or at least in how I present it. And what I mean by that is being short, either with an employee or being short with a patient that I'm supposed to be spending time with. I'm supposed to be doing my very best for, because things happen that get you behind and you feel stressed to get back on track. And so as a result, you can compromise. There can be compromises either in your work or how you treat those people. I think that's one. I think what Davis was saying also, I've had an instance where, I had a patient pass away a couple days after, let me rephrase that. She was in the hospital in ICU for a really bad infection that could have been as a result of some treatment that we did. And, based on the state guidelines, you're supposed to, if you have a patient that goes in the hospital, you're supposed to give all this information. And, I'd probably say most dentists may not do that. But so there was an opportunity that, I was challenged and faced with, do I provide all the information that, I'm supposed to? It turns out it wasn't related at all, but nevertheless, that was my obligation. So I think there's things there that, that are a challenge. And then I think, too, as far as the faith just in running a business, just the busyness of life. I think getting stressed, getting worried, getting out of time for spending time with your family, I think that begins to wear on you and can challenge your faith also because it takes you away from your Lord. It takes you away from spending time with Him, and that leads to challenging your faith.
That's actually a great segue to my last question. I mean, you kind of mentioned this earlier of, your job, Stephen, does not end when you come home. You start a new job or you put on a new hat. And you've talked about that too, Molly, with raising 3 boys and doing nonprofit work and all these myriad of things. And so I'd love to just kind of end our time here with, how do you balance your priorities and commitments between your job and your family life and your church life and your civic life, et cetera?
Well, I started off in a different position than I'm in now at Baylor, and I was an associate vice president, and I had a lot of people that I was managing, and speaking of stress, I did not handle that very well, and definitely as a female, I think sometimes you bring everything home, whereas Davis cuts it off and is like, hey, I'm here, after being in conflict all day. So I chose, Davis and I prayed about it, and I felt like I needed to step down out of that role. But I asked Baylor if they wanted to keep me on, that I'd work for anybody that's worked for me, and I'd do whatever, job that they felt like that I could do from here. And so I got presented with a new role that's completely different and totally low on the totem pole, and I absolutely love it because I can leave it. And for me, at this stage in my life, I can leave it, but yet I am active and engaged. And once I get the boys, I've no stress. And I feel like they can call on me for different things because I do know our organization very, very well. So it's been a unique opportunity to be able, it's also been humbling, which is great. And I have no pride in, when a person that used to work for me says, Molly, I need you to, look into this. And I just feel like I'm here to help. Also with that balance of knowing that the nonprofit world will take, you got to cut it off. And I could do that a little bit easier now in the role that I'm in, so it's a great fit, for me.
This is a biggie for me because I love my profession. I love what I do so often. I think the danger for me was what I do is who I am. And so this was kind of a moment for me about 2 years ago. I was on a consulting job out in Philadelphia, actually, and a teacher looked at me. I'd been doing some distance coaching with her remotely, and she looked at me. We were debriefing, and she said, I noticed in your emails, you always say, call me anytime, email me anytime. She said, she looked at me square in the face, and she said, you're not a doctor. She said, you're not always on call. And time stopped, and I looked at her, and I said, can you just say that again? Can you just say that out loud to me again? And she said, you're not a doctor. And I thought, this was a moment for me. It was kind of one of those holy moments where I literally wrote on a Post-it note, I'm not a doctor. And I put it on my laptop, I'm not a doctor, I'm not on call. And it needed to be tattooed on my forehead because we all fill in the blank too much. We have these kind of go-to behaviors sometimes. And for me, it was certainly work. And so I have to fight for an integrated life, as Carolyn says. I have to fight for that because my identity, my worth, my value so often can be tied up in what I do. And so I had to make some really critical decisions at that point to fight for that integration. And so that meant when my family was home after school, my computer now goes in an office. And so I had to make some choices. I had to say no more often. I had to say yes to the right things more often. Ultimately, I resigned from a position that allows for balance and space to take place a bit more in my life. So really, though, I think examining what your work-life balance and what value and where you see yourself and your identity and worth related to what you do.
Fantastic. Those are great practical applications, Andrea, and thank you for sharing those. And Molly, your experience too. So I want to thank our panel real quick. Just a little quick clap of hands here for their bravery to come up and speak honestly about how God's led them and used them in the workplace in mighty ways. And so I now have some follow-up for you guys as well of with our conference and then even for our students throughout this semester. So following up with this, session 2, Jobs for Life, is a phenomenal practical application of how to integrate your faith and your work directly in this community and how you can directly impact people with how God's blessed you in the vocation that he's chosen for you. So I highly encourage that talk, as well as Dr. Schaub's look at integrating your faith and work, and specifically more dealing with a little bit with ethics in the workplace. So both are going to be great follow-ups to this session. For our students that are here, our college ministry is doing their first half of the spring series is on Every Good Endeavor on Tim Keller's book. And so we invite you Sunday mornings, both Anderson and Southwood, to be a part of that discussion with Trey and with Jacob. And then for our graduating seniors, our Life After College study this semester is over Every Good Endeavor. So again, signups are online for that at grace-bible.org/college. Invite you to sign up for that study. It'll be starting in February. So lastly, we have, as Trey mentioned, the book Every Good Endeavor is at our resource table out there. So invite you to pick that up before you leave today. So thank you everybody for coming today to this talk. It was so wonderful to be a part of it with you all this morning. And hopefully it's kind of shifted your gears, changed your gears a little bit on how you see your vocation and how it fits into God's purposes to build his kingdom. So thank you, everybody.